were so effective. There was a shit ton of them, a lot of them. There were more T34s made in the course of World War II than all German tank production combined. That's pretty significant. They also made the KV series and the BT series. So, all in all, the Russians ended up making tanks at almost, well, a little over a 2-to-1 ratio over the Germans. The Americans, however, were able to put almost 20,000 knocked out tanks back into service within a day or two. How were they able to do that? Well, funny story, modular design. They made it so that the transmission could be unbolted from one of them and put onto another. Let's say you get a tank that gets hit by a German 88. Goes through the transmission, goes through the housing, goes through the crew compartment, makes a big old mess of pretty much everything. But there's parts of that machine that you're going to want to take off because you might have another machine that has, well, let's say that particular round went through, didn't do a whole lot of damage to everything, it just destroyed the engine and the transmission. Well, you could take the engine out of one Sherman and replace it within about 6 hours, 45 minutes with a full crew complement. By a full crew complement, I mean a full service crew. You couldn't do that on a Russian tank or a German tank. With a Russian tank, they figured if it fell apart, just leave it there. With the Germans, they figured if it fell apart, they'd send it all the way back to the factory it was made in. Americans figured, well, if it's broke down on the battlefield, there's probably more than one broke down on the battlefield. The chances that they all have the same exact problem in the same exact place is next to nothing. So we'll just salvage parts and keep it running. While the Russians were able to do that on a small level, and the Germans tried to do that on a small level, it was mostly just smaller parts. But again, when it comes down to it, the German crews were not taught so well how to fix and maintain their tanks when damaged the way that American crews were. That's something that American crews really fought heavy for. Since the United States was going to be fighting any of its battles, likely across the ocean, it's difficult to get all of those parts all the way across the ocean. It would be better if we could just send brand new tanks across the ocean already fully assembled, and you could scag parts off of them if you needed. The Sherman tanks, they tried to make it so that all the bolt-ons would remain the same throughout the war. Even if there was an improvement, the improvement could be lashed on to any of the old Shermans. At one point, they did go from having a cast body and a cast shell to having a welded shell, much like the Germans or Russians did. And on the Russian tanks, you could tell which factory it was made in, because a lot of different factories made the T34. You could tell which factory it was made in by the way the sloped armor was assembled. All very cool stuff to know. Anyway, there's a couple other things that America was really good at, but the modular thing was just phenomenal. Everything Americans made was made so that it could be interchanged with other stuff made in America. For example, you could take a part off of just about any Gato submarine or Baleo class submarine that was made in America, and any compartment would interchange with any other submarine compartment of that type. You could literally cut it out of the submarine, slide in the other part, weld it back together, same size, same space. So that allowed them to make, well, large quantities of it. The same thing with the Jeep carriers. The Jeep carrier is the general purpose carrier, or the slow carrier, or the convoy carrier, or the escort carrier. They're all names for the same thing. Now, y'all get to hear about the Liberty ships and about how some of them were known for cracking and falling in half, and at the very beginning it was like that. So they realized that they had to actually put more space in between the beams to give the ship more flex, and that it was that lack of flex that was breaking the ships and making them crack and fall apart. Anyway, we had the, God, what are they called? I want to say the Casablanca class were built right on top of Liberty ships. It was literally a Liberty ship with a flight deck on top. One of the greater ideas to come out of the war, somebody had the idea of taking some of the landing ships, LSTs, landing ship tank. You could actually take, basically it's two pontoons with a deck at the very bottom of them, so it kind of keeps water out of it. Strange looking thing. But the two pontoons that are on the side are actually the walls or the hull of the ship, and you can fill them, the ballast at the front or the back, so that you can have it settle, and that way you can just drop the front. You open the two doors on it, they open like this, and then there's a ramp that drops down, and once the ramp drops down, you can drive out your tanks, your jeeps, your infantry, whatever you got to get out of there, and they can drive right up to the beach, just like a regular landing barge like you see in the World War II movies. Anyway, when it comes to modular design, the Germans kind of sort of got it at the end of the war. With the Type 21, they were really trying, but they just couldn't get the parts to fit together right. They went from making a bunch of stuff that had skilled laborers building it to now everything's built by slave labor. Most of the stuff at the end of the war suffered from that issue. Now, the Romans, they did kind of the same thing. A lot of these societies, the conquering societies, hit the same issue. Slave labor is not good labor. You can see American production versus German slave production, how incredibly slow the slave labor production was, and the lowest quality possible, versus American women who wanted their GIs to come home. They wanted them to have the best equipment, and they wanted them to have a lot of it. Make sure they got too many guns rather than not enough. Too many airplanes rather than not enough. You could take a T34 out on a battlefield, and you'd lose it in a matter of minutes. Or you could take even one of the German heavy Tigers, and you might be able to keep it on the battlefield for an hour or so. That was the average, by the way. An hour. 1 hour on the battlefield for a big, heavy Tiger tank. And some estimates put it at closer to 15 minutes. Now you'd go out there with a Sherman, and mind you, I didn't put the British tanks, any of them, on the list for a reason. It's because in World War II, the best tank that the British ever had through all of it was the Sherman Firefly. And that's not really a British tank. It's an American tank with a British 17-pounder gun on it. So, again, Sherman Firefly. It's a Sherman. Or rather, an adaptation to a Sherman that could have been put on any other Sherman. So, one of the things about the Sherman is that you could get 5 out of 6 tanks knocked out by a German crew before you take out a German tank. As long as you got more troops to put in there, as long as you have a few seasoned veterans in the tank, you can get a pretty lazy crew of idiots put together well enough to run that tank in just a few hours. Now, in order to run it efficiently, yeah, you'd need a lot more time than that, but just enough to get you going down the road and knowing the basic commands, practicing it out on the field, you could probably get it done in an hour or two easily. So when you figure modular design and you start looking at the ME-262, this is completely different from the Sherman. For the Sherman, all this stuff comes together into a real big factory that's in no danger of being bombed whatsoever. And you can just produce shit at your heart's content, whereas the German stuff was getting bombed. So then, of course, you get this stuff across the ocean, and most of it is making it here because the Germans, well, especially by the end of the war, just couldn't stop the flow of traffic across the Atlantic. We also had all of our aircraft production here. The escort carriers, we made them by the Casablanca class. We made like 50 of those. The most produced aircraft carrier series in history. Now, they could hold anywhere from 18 to 34 aircraft. 34 aircraft if they were fitted just for transporting them, and 18 to 23 of them if they were wanting or hoping to expect to launch. The reason for that is because all the airplanes that would have been strapped to the deck, if you're going to have to expect to launch aircraft, you're going to be able to, you're going to need to have to receive the aircraft when they want to land. All of this stuff was made in modular sections, kind of like Henry Ford designed. Adolf Hitler actually had a autographed picture, apparently, of Henry Ford's in his office. But that man helped to pioneer the idea of having all Model Ts the same, all Model As the same enough that you could bolt a part off of one and bolt it onto another. All the engines exactly the same. The chassis is similar enough that the bolt holes line up. Smart ideas. The Germans never got that, and the Russians, they were so busy just trying to slap stuff together so they get it out there that they didn't bother to make anything modular. If the engine ran, put it in there and hope it works. If the engine doesn't run, send it back to the factory, hopefully they fix it. Russian machinery, especially at the beginning of the war, was notorious for breaking down. 2/3 of the Yak 3s that they put on the airfields didn't even make it off the airfields. They wouldn't work. But there's a lot of other airplanes that they came out with that absolutely did work. And by the end of the war, airplanes like the Aleutian were well known for taking mass quantities of damage from fighter aircraft of the Germans. The IL-2s, I believe. Now, out of all of this, the Germans, the only things that they really made modular that actually worked were, well, like the German Me-262. Similar to in America, where it was mass produced in a lot of factories and then sent to a big factory to be assembled, the Germans assembled it in basically small bicycle workshops all over Germany or German held territories, and then they had to transport all of these parts into a place where the aircraft could be assembled in the woods. It was a lot of work. So basically, the Germans ended up building a bunch of stuff out in the woods. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that you can actually build it out in the woods. It tells us that a highly industrialized nation can be forced into a situation like that. And it shows that people can persevere and even make something so complicated as a fighter jet under those conditions. But also, if you pay close attention, there's a cost in human lives. You're going to get better production out of willing participants than slave labor. You're going to get a better product out of it as well. Sometimes you just need mass quantities. But even under those conditions of needing mass quantities, you still want it to be up to a production level that is still maintainable as functional tools. No matter what piece of kit you have as a soldier or really as somebody who wants to survive, if it's not functional, it doesn't matter how cheap you got it. The T34s, some of them actually fell in half. That's how shoddily they were welded together. But some of them were still running in 2019. The modular design of the Me-262 makes it so that we could literally make the Me-262 today. You can also get the blueprints for it offline. Or online, sorry. You can print them out, it'll give you the right specs, the right measurements. You can literally make your own Me-262. The tough parts would be getting the engines, but you can even get the designs for those as long as you've got a decent enough background in metallurgy and casting. There's also the fact that the Me-262, when they first made it, they had to test it with a prop engine. So, you can make an Me-262 that runs off of a prop engine. Those are a lot easier to come by. As far as the tanks go, the reason that the American Shermans were the best tank of the war isn't because they were the ones that were the most produced. And it wasn't because they were the best as far as armor penetration. It wasn't because they were fastest, because they weren't. It was the fact that they were there, and if you knocked one out of commission, You could take parts off of another one and get it back into commission by the next day. You lose a couple of crew members, you can pick yourself up a couple of infantrymen and put them in that spot and have them working by the next day. A radio man was a little tougher to get a hold of, but they also had reserves of those for a reason. Anyway, we got the same thing going on here. We don't make anything all that modular anymore. We make a bunch of specialized plastic molding and specialized crap that covers up this and covers up that. Plastic galore all over the place. Everything covered in more plastic. Doesn't need to be that complicated. We could make this car modular. Make it so you back off if you don't want it to be a car today. You want to use it as a pickup. Yeah, you could make it modular. There's a type of truck that's based off of the Thing. The Thing is a type of German vehicle. I don't remember what they called it. But the Volkswagen van style of it has different ways that the back can fold up, including having a canvas roof over the top of it or a sliding hardtop. And you can basically turn it into the equivalent of a real ugly Volkswagen bus. It don't have to look pretty, it just has to function. Now, one of the things I was wanting to say about the landing ship tank is that if you'd built not a submarine, a aircraft carrier on top of a couple of those, just line two of them up. If you built an aircraft carrier on top of something like that, you'd have something special, because on the inside of it, you've also got the ability, they can flood it out and fill those things up with men who are in DUKWs or ducks. And you could actually, there's also the, what was it, the LST? No, I'm trying to remember. Anyway, it's a tank that you could literally drive through the water. And it wasn't a Sherman. It was too light to be considered actually a tank. But you could drive these things, add one of these landing ship tanks while they were still out at sea, which is pretty cool. A few times they showed the maneuvers where they'd try to get the people out of them as fast as possible, make a couple of circles, and then come back in. That way they could practice getting as many out as possible as quickly as possible. That way the ship could back out and get out of there. But if you put in a lot of alright, for example, you got two different types of ships other than destroyers out on the ocean in World War II that were going to be dropping torpedoes. One of them was a submarine, even a midget submarine, and the other one was the patrol boats. Like what John F. Kennedy was on, the PT boats. Anyway, in one of the LSTs, something like that, you could fill that up with midget submarines. You could fill that up with patrol boats. You could fill it up with a whole lot of stuff that drops torpedoes real quick, fast, and in a hurry. And you got a base platform for them to come back to. It's all about being modular about it. That's something that America's been getting away from, and that's also something that's making everything expensive, and making it expensive to fix, expensive to maintain, and making it so the average man can't work on it himself. Most of the stuff that I design it to be modular, but not everything. The other thing is, without a place to build it, I don't get to do anything. I'm stuck taking hell for existing. All right, I'm going to go in and get another coffee. Anyway, I'm sure y'all can think of stuff that's modular. You guys probably like the Nazis about as much as I do, which is to say that you don't. However, I recommend looking at the ME-262. It was built in approximately 8-foot sections at a time. Each of these 8-foot sections could be bolted together just about anywhere, including a national forest. All right. Good to be with you. Thanks for coming to visit. Stay out of trouble or don't get caught. Remember, you are your brother's keeper and your sister's too, and no victim left behind. Also, remember the Sherman tank was specifically designed so the turret on it and the main gun on it could be used as a hydraulic lift, so they could lift out their engines, they could lift off the front end of another tank, they could do the work that they needed to do, and they had a lift right there. All right, be safe.